Hello there. Welcome to another episode of Happy to Meet. This episode is brought to you by your friends at professionalelectricalservices.ca. My name is Craig. In this episode, we are remembering Jack Johnson. Born in Galveston, Texas, on the 31st day of March, 1878, Jack the Galveston Giant Johnson, a nickname he earned based on his 6.5-foot tall stance, his towering advantage over many of his opponents, eventually earned him the world heavyweight title, which he held from 1908 to 1915. Incidentally, John Arthur Johnson, or Jack Johnson, as he's better known, was the first Afro-American to ever hold the world heavyweight title. It was actually Jack the Galveston Giant Johnson who broke the color barriers when it came to white Caucasian boxers fighting against African-American boxers. And it was the fight of the century, as it was dubbed, that took place on July 4th, 1910, in which Johnson absolutely pummeled James Jeffries in a match that was slated to last an astonishing 45 3-minute rounds. Well, it only took 15 rounds before Johnson dropped Jeffries to the ground for the second time in the fight. And the fight was called at that point by Jeffries' team. See, they didn't want to see him get knocked out. It was that bad. The results of the fight ensued in racial riots all over the states. Why all the rioting? Because for whites all over the U.S., James Jeffries was supposed to be what they had dubbed as the Great White Hope, the white man to finally beat Jack Johnson. But they were let down yet again. And Johnson did more to blur the lines of segregation between black and white with his preference of white women, of which he married 3 over his lifetime. This would later turn to jail time for Jack Johnson, as he was arrested for his interracial relationships because they were in violation of the Mann Act that was signed into law in 1910. Allegedly, they say the main purpose of the Mann Act, M-A-N-N Act, named after one of the politicians that had the last name of Mann that helped create this act. The main purpose of it was to address the prostitution and human trafficking. But some other nuances were poorly, if not purposely, interpreted through the act to allow authorities to actually use the Mann Act to prosecute against premarital or extramarital, or get this, interracial relationships. So they had the Mann Act to arrest Johnson for an interracial relationship. He was arrested twice in 1912 under the Mann Act, and eventually went back to jail after being on the lam for about 8 years while continuing his boxing career in Europe, South America, Mexico, a couple other places. But then in 1920, he finally went back to the U.S. and he surrendered and he did his time. So 10 months in prison for, yes, being a black man in a relationship with a white woman. Incidentally, over 100 years after the fact, Jack Johnson was actually pardoned of his convictions under the Mann Act by none other than former President Donald Trump. Johnson, he faced a rather untimely death on June 10th, 1946, after the 68-year-old was refused service at an all-white diner in Franklinton, North Carolina. In Franklinton, North Carolina, the diner there, they refused him. They kicked him out, wouldn't feed him. He got so angry and so upset at this, he went tearing out of the place, hopped in his car and raced down the road and smashed into a telephone pole. Later that day, he would be pronounced dead. And to think, as a young kid growing up, Jack Johnson didn't even experience much racism or segregation. He hung out with a gang of white friends. He slept over at their houses. He ate the same meals at the same tables with his white friends. It wasn't until later on in life that he'd really start experiencing segregation and racial discourse. So thank you to Jack Johnson for starting to break down the walls of racism as far back as the first decade of the 1900s. And this is just a small glimpse into the life of Jack Johnson. Make sure to check out more videos on talkandfight.com. And please be sure to click the like button below and hit subscribe to be notified of future episodes. I look forward to being with you again down the road on the next episode of Happy to Meet.